Today we are going through the 5 most common guitar amp mistakes that hobby and intermediate players make. And then we are going to talk about what professional players, session musicians, and working touring guitarists actually use instead. Some of the answers are going to be different than what the YouTube amp reviewers have been telling you for years. Let us start with the biggest one. Mistake 1. Buying too much AMP. Walk into a guitar store, explain that you play rock, and there is a decent chance the salesperson is going to steer you toward a 50 or 100-watt tube amp. The logic sounds compelling. More watts means more headroom, more power, more tone. The problem is that tube amplifiers reach their best sound when the power tubes are being pushed into saturation. On a 100-watt amp, that happens at volumes that are genuinely dangerous in a small room. A Marshall JCM 800 100-watt needs to be pushed past volume 5 to start sounding like a Marshall. And at that volume, you are looking at over 100 decibels of sound pressure in a home environment. Your neighbors will know you exist. Your family will hate you. And the amp is still not fully cooking. This is why most professional guitarists in studio and mid-size venue settings are running 15 to 30 watt amps, a Vox AC15, a Fender Princeton Reverb, a Supro Blackmagic, a Morgan AC20, a Victory Sheriff 22. These amps reach their sweet spot at volumes that are loud but controllable, and they sound massive through a microphone because the tubes are actually working. The pros who do use 100-watt heads for big stages are using power attenuators, master volume circuits, power scaling, or load boxes to bring the output down to manageable levels while still pushing the power section. That is the key distinction. The 100-watt amp is not being run at full power. It is being tricked into sounding like a smaller amp at a smaller volume. So if you are playing at home or at a small venue, a 100-watt amp is actively working against your tone. A 15-watt amp will sound better in your living room than a 100-watt amp almost every time. Mistake 2. Ignoring the speaker. This might be the most overlooked factor in guitar tone. The speaker is the single biggest tonal driver in your entire amp chain. Change the speaker in a cheap amp, and you can transform the sound. Leave a stock speaker in a $3,000 boutique head, and you will be disappointed with your tone no matter how much you spent on the amp itself. The Celestion Vintage 30 is the most recorded guitar speaker in rock history. It is in most of the cabinets on most of the records you listen to. A Celestion Greenback gives you the classic British rock mid-range that every Marshall into a stack player is chasing. A Creamback sits between the two and handles higher gain genres better than the vintage speakers do. The speaker has its own frequency response curve, its own breakup character, and its own compression profile. A great amp through a mediocre speaker sounds mediocre. A mediocre amp through a great speaker sounds surprisingly good. If your tone is not working and you have already tried new pedals and new pickups, the speaker is almost always the missing piece. Most stock combos ship with adequate speakers, not great ones. The manufacturers have to hit a price point. Swapping a stock speaker for a Celestion Creamback or a Vintage 30 typically costs between $100 and $200 and can produce more tonal improvement than any other upgrade in the signal chain. Mistake 3. Buying a modeling amp and expecting it to sound like a record out of the box. Digital modeling has gotten genuinely good in the last 5 years. The Fractal Audio FM9, the Kemper Profiler, the Neural DSP Quad Cortex, and the Line 6 Helix can produce tones that are indistinguishable from the original tube amps they are modeling when used correctly. Problem is that most players buy a modeler, plug it into a regular guitar amp cabinet, and expect it to sound finished. That is not how modelers are designed to work. A modeler is producing a line-level signal that is supposed to include the amp, the speaker, the cabinet, and the microphone simulation all at once. Plugging that signal into another guitar speaker is adding a second speaker and cabinet to a signal that already has both simulated. Professional modeler users run their units into full-range flat response monitors, into in-ear monitors, or directly into the recording interface with the cabinet simulation and impulse response engaged. The impulse response, which is a captured audio fingerprint of a real speaker cabinet recorded with a specific microphone, is the single biggest factor in whether a modeler sounds good or bad. A great IR on a modest modeler will often beat a mediocre IR on an expensive unit. The players getting pro-level tone out of a quad cortex are using IRs from companies like ML Sound Lab, Ownhammer, or 3 Sigma Audio, and they are dialing in the same IR placement and microphone choice decisions that a tube amp player makes in a studio. If your modeling amp sounds thin, sterile, or fake, the problem is almost never the amp model itself. It is the signal path, the IR, or the monitoring system. Mistake 4. Neglecting the room and the microphone when recording. Here's a test. Take the best guitar amp you have ever heard live. Put it in an untreated bedroom, record it with a $6 USB microphone, and listen back. It is going to sound worse than a cheap practice amp recorded in a proper studio with proper placement. The microphone placement and the room are doing more work than most home recordists realize. A Shure SM57 on the edge of a speaker dust cap, angled 3 inches off axis, produces a completely different recording than the same mic pointed straight on at the cone center. The difference is night and day. Professional engineers spend as much time on mic placement as they do on amp selection. The room is even more important. A living room with bare walls and hard floors will produce audible slapback echoes that will never sound professional, no matter how expensive the amp is. Basic acoustic treatment, even just a couple of moving blankets hung on stands and a rug on the floor, can transform a home recording. The pros who record guitar amps at home have treated their rooms, usually minimally, but deliberately. For direct capture workflows, reamping has become the standard. You record the clean guitar signal to a dedicated track, then send that signal through a reamp box into the actual amp later, or into a modeler in software. This lets you adjust the amp and microphone settings after the performance is already done, which is why most modern productions use some variation of this approach. If you are home recording without treatment, without careful mic placement, and without a proper signal chain, upgrading your amp is the last thing you should be spending money on. Mistake 5. Chasing the brand instead of matching the amp to the style. This one is cultural. Every guitarist has an amp brand they believe is the one true answer. Fender for cleans, Marshall for rock, Vox for jangle, Mesa for metal, Dumble for boutique fusion. The marketing and the YouTube videos have reinforced those associations for decades, but the amps exist in tonal families. A Fender Blackface Deluxe is a specific tonal environment. Clear bell-like cleans with just a hint of breakup at higher volumes. A Vox AC30 is a different tonal environment, glassy, jangly, top-heavy, with a specific mid-range that cuts through a band mix. A Marshall Plexi gives you the classic British rock mid-range bite. Each of those amps is great for the style it was designed for and mediocre for the styles it was not. The boutique clean amps, the Dumble originals, and the Two Rock and the Fuchs clones produce a tone that is difficult to describe unless you have played one. The note attack is immediate. The compression is musical. The frequency response is tuned specifically for fusion, jazz, and clean rock voicings. Buying a Dumble to play grindcore is like buying a race car to haul lumber. The amp is spectacular at what it does and useless for what it does not. On the high gain side, Orange, Friedman, Bogner, diesel, and mesa rectifier occupy different tonal domains within the same broad category. An orange amp has a specific mid-range push that works for doom and stoner rock. A Friedman BE100 gives you a refined modern Marshall tone. A diesel VH4 is designed for ultra-tight modern metal. Players who buy based on brand reputation, rather than matching the amp to their actual playing, end up with great amps that do not serve the music they make. If you are finding this helpful, hit subscribe. We cover guitar gear and technique every week, so you can play better and spend smarter. All right, let us talk about what professional players actually use. In 2026, the reality is that most working touring guitarists are running a digital modeler as their primary rig. A Fractal Axe FX, a Kemper Profiler, or a Quad Cortex sits in the back of the stage, sends a line signal to front of house, and feeds the player's in-ear monitors. The backline guitar cabinets on stage are often silent or powered down entirely, used only for stage presence, if at all. This is true of major touring acts, of session players on professional albums, and increasingly of independent artists who want to travel light. The amp head itself has become a studio luxury item, rather than a performance necessity. For the players who do bring a tube amp to a gig, it is usually a single mid-power combo in the 15 to 30 watt range, paired with a modeler as a backup. In the studio, the story is different. A lot of pro studio players still prefer tube amps for the feel under the hands, even if the final recorded sound comes from a reamped modeler signal. The tube amp provides dynamic response that is hard to replicate, and many players prefer to record with an amp, even if they know the engineer might replace it later. The amps that have become pro studio favorites in 2026 are the mid-power boutique tube amps, the Victory V30 and Sheriff models, the Morgan AC20, the Matchless DC30, the Supro Delta King, the Bad Cat Hot Cat 15. These amps sit in a sweet spot where they sound great at moderate volumes. They have enough character to compete with vintage tube amps on a recording, and they fit in a compartment on an airline flight. The Fender 68 Custom Deluxe Reverb and the Vox AC15 are still the two most rented amps in professional recording studios. That is the actual benchmark. Those amps have been ubiquitous on pro records for 60 years, and they are on pro records today. Now let us end with the simpler truth that nobody selling amps wants you to hear. 90% of great guitar tone is setup, hands, and signal chain. The player's touch, the guitar's intonation and setup, the strings, the pick, the cable, the pedals, and the volume level combine to produce the sound. The amp is the final stage, not the starting point. A great player with a cheap amp will sound better than a mediocre player with an expensive amp every time. The amp is not going to fix weak technique, sloppy timing, or wrong note choices. What the amp will do is reward the player who has already put in the work to develop a good sound. If you are going to upgrade one thing in your rig in 2026, upgrade the speaker in whatever amp you already own. Replace your cables. Get your guitar set up by a qualified tech. Learn to place a microphone. Treat your recording room, even minimally. Those investments will transform your tone more than any new amplifier will. The best amp in the world will not make you sound like your favorite player, but the right setup, the right signal chain, and the right amp matched to your actual style will make you sound like the best version of yourself. Drop a comment and tell me what amp you are running right now. And if you have made any of these mistakes yourself, we have all made at least one of them.